You and Betty and the Nancys and Bills and Joes and Janes will find in the study of science a richer, more rewarding life.
Hey, welcome to Inquiring Minds. I'm Indre Viskontas. This is a podcast where we explore the space where science and society collide. We want to find out what's true, what's left to discover, and why it matters. And when it comes to the collision of science and society, one major driver seems to be morality, or what we consider to be right and good, and why the other side is wrong or bad. They're morally bankrupt, right? Or so we each think. Morality is complicated, and usually I leave it to the philosophers to fight it out. And outside of defining my own moral values, I don't tend to look at it through the lens of science. But what if we could apply some of the principles that pulled psychology out of the subjective dark ages and into objective reality? What if instead of talking about moral values, we focused on moral behavior, the observable aspects of this complex system? Enter Kurt Gray, a professor of psychology and neuroscience at UNC Chapel Hill, where he directs the Center for the Science of Moral Understanding. It's never been more critical to understand the other side when our deeply divided nation and many other countries in the world use moral values to make policy decisions, ones that affect everyone. Even when faced with natural disasters, morality is coming into play like never before. So, to figure out how we can overcome our divisions, maybe we need a little more science in our morality and a little objectivity to help us deal with our outrage. Kurt Gray, welcome to Inquiring Minds.
Thanks so much for having me. Excited to talk.
So let's talk about your methods and how do you observe morality? How do you know what people's morals are and how they might drive their behavior?
Well, as anyone who's probably had a conversation about morality or politics in the last decade, people will tell you what their moral convictions are. And so a lot of what we do is just ask people with standard kind of survey measurements what people are thinking, what people are feeling, and their kind of deepest beliefs. We do additional things than just ask about explicit kind of moral values. We also use implicit measurements, so get people to respond very quickly, get people to respond while remembering like a long number to kind of force them to make intuitive gut decisions. And in the book, we also talk about some of the experiments we've run that involve something a little more involved, like getting people to pretend that they're hurting each other, kind of like Hollywood realism. But it's a lot of surveys, but it's a lot more as well.
I mean, I think, a lot of people know about the Stanford prison experiment and, the way that, people can be driven to do things that they otherwise in external conditions would consider morally reprehensible. Is that something also that plays into your lab, or are you taking a different approach?
So we are studying less, can you get people to do immoral things? Although, we've run studies where people do things that make them feel very uncomfortable. But, since the Stanford prison experiment, since Milgram, it's not really kosher anymore to do studies where people actually think they're harming each other. Although, to be fair, I have run studies where people think they're shocking each other. Why be a social psychologist if you don't run studies like that? But for the most part, we're looking at people's kind of subjective understanding of their moral world and how they make sense of right or wrong when it comes to hot button issues and kind of everyday morality as well.
So one of the arguments against the Stanford prison experiment was, or the, Milgram is not that it was that the people who were harmed were harmed, but rather that the people who were doing the harming were essentially experiencing a kind of trauma of realizing that they could be the person who's doing this kind of harm. Does that come into play? And even if they're like fake shocking someone?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, the when you run these studies, there's always kind of ethical questions, right? And whether the kind of benefits for society outweigh the potential harm to individuals. I think in our case, the participants were totally anonymous. I know in the Milgram study, they weren't necessarily anonymous, right? There was a documentary, and so people would go by the gas station where one of the Milgram participants worked, and like, you're a murderer, right? That's hard to outlive. In our studies, the harms that people give on others is very small. And in fact, in the one study we ran where people were shocking others, we told them, your job is to safeguard the other person, give them as many shocks as you think they can handle, but no more. Like, you're trying to protect them. It's a very different mindset there. In some of the other studies where we have them perform kind of fake harmful actions, like pretend to smash someone's leg with a hammer, but the leg is a piece of PVC piping, and the person who they're smashing is an experimental accomplice. There's lots of layers of kind of theater there. And, it's hard for people to do that, but even then people know it's fake. So we really make sure that these experiments aren't psychologically harmful, but you can still pull out lots of important insights about the mind from them.
So let's start with some of these insights. At the very beginning of the book, you have this really great two sentences that I would love to read back to you, because, that's not annoying at all. But it's very simple, and I really liked it a lot. So we have a harm-based moral mind. Our evolutionary past makes us worry about harm, but people today disagree about which threats are most important or most real. And that is what creates moral outrage and political disagreement. So I guess we should start with this. There's that first part of the sentence, which is that it's about threat and harm that sort of sets where our moral compass sits. How do you know that? And, how did that come about?
Right. So I think there's maybe two answers to this. There's like the clean narrative version in the book, which is about, let's think about human nature back in the past and how that translates to our mind, which translates to how we should bridge divides today. And so that's how it's kind of woven together in the book, because, we're storytelling creatures and we like clean narratives. I think how it started in real life and the kind of science and the studies that I ran is, a little more inside baseball maybe, but, there's a theory in the field of moral psychology that's popular that says, harm can be important, but there's lots of other moral concerns beyond harm, some moral concerns that are totally separate from harm. And so I thought, this is interesting, and I started to test this. But what I found is that no matter what kind of moral value or conviction I looked at, people seemed to care about it based on how much it was connected to kind of perceptions of harm, to worries about threat. And so it kind of grew organically from the data that everywhere I looked, I was just seeing the same thing, harm. It didn't matter whether people were condemning gay marriage or hitting a child or cheating on a test, or even really weird things we can talk about, eating pizza off a corpse, which seems not to be harmful, right? Yeah. Moral psychology is a weird field. But when people condemn these things, they condemn them based on how much they saw them as causing harm or suffering. So that's where it came from. It came from the science.
And I think that's really interesting, because I think when I think about what are the things that, make me feel outraged about people who disagree with my moral values, is that I feel like they are, that the harm they're worried about isn't real, that threat isn't real. And so reading your book actually made me realize how much my outrage is tied to the dismissal of what seems to be a credible threat in a person's eyes with whom I disagree.
Absolutely, right. I think that's absolutely right. And I think your experience was not appreciated by the kind of scientific field of moral psychology in a way that I think it should be. And I think that the data reveal. And so a lot of our moral outrage, and we have a number of studies, we're working on this right now, kind of focus on this role of kind of harm denial and how people get really incensed when you think, this is causing irreparable harm to children. And the other side's like, nah, It's like, that's not the harm. Like, this is the harm. Or like, you're inventing these harms. And so people on both sides are doing this, right? They're like powerfully and intuitively, like really in your gut, seeing some act as harmful to some group of people. And then the other side's like, no, I totally see this different harm and your harm is wrong. And so we have this disagreement about who the real victim is, not just politics, but it could be about with your spouse or with a coworker, right? They all revolve around conceptions of harm.
One of the things that I've been really thinking about deeply is this sense of how our sense of taste and disgust, and essentially the part of the brain called the insular cortex, is one of the main key drivers of how we respond to social situations and kind of this social morality question. And it pulls to me this idea of threat and harm, I think, goes beyond just like, oh, I'm afraid, therefore, I'm going to get mad at you, I'm going to get really outraged. When it comes into this sense of like, this thing, is disgusting to me, is like, it kind of approaches that other type of emotional experience that I think more akin to moral, when we feel like someone's doing something that we find morally reprehensible. It's more about disgust and less about fear. I wonder if you think about those as like separate potential emotional states or drivers, or how are they connected? Does one precede the other? What do you think about this kind of relationship between the emotions of fear and disgust and how it relates to the sense of threat?
It's a great question, and we've tested this idea in a lot of different studies, actually, because I think the narrative in moral psychology of what drives our moral judgments is grounded in this idea often of disgust, right? Like if I tell you about eating pizza on a corpse, to go back to that example, or lots of other things that people would say are kind of technically harmless, and that what drives your antipathy, your condemnation of that act is kind of grounded in disgust. But I kind of argue, and I think our data support this, is that disgust is, and negative affect in general, if we can kind of zoom out, is not sufficient for moral condemnation, because there's lots of disgusting things that are disgusting but not immoral. So stepping on dog poop, or the example that I often use is, one afternoon my daughter was sick. She was sitting on the couch and she says like, "Dad, I need to go to the bathroom." Oh my goodness, like for what? And she's like, everything, So I like pick her up and I'm like running to the bathroom, and she simultaneously throws up on me and then has like explosive diarrhea. Incredibly disgusting, right? I'm just like covered in effluvia. But when I tell people this, no one's like, "You monster." Like you deserve to go to jail for this like terrible. No, it's just disgusting. And so I think, I think what separates the kind of disgusting and immoral from the disgusting and not immoral, like just disgusting, is these kind of conceptions of harm. You think it's harmful. And so we have some data on, let's say, social media and kind of condemnation, or even kind of the condemnation of harmless acts. Like in one study, we asked Christians to imagine that that Jesus is not God. This is something that, very strongly convicted religious folks think is immoral to do. They also find it disgusting because that kind of sacrilegious thought is like within their head. But it turns out that the connection between those feelings of disgust and moral condemnation is really driven or mediated, we say, by this feeling that those thoughts will cause harm, that entertaining those thoughts will lead to bad things. And so disgust is important when it comes to morality, but it's really kind of driven most proximately by these concerns about harm or threat.
One of the reasons I ask this is because it seems really difficult to extinguish disgust. Like if you've ever had, food poisoning, it's really hard to then go back and eat that food. It seems very evolutionarily adaptive to never eat again the thing that made you violently ill. So I understand why that would have that kind of one trial learning. Fear, also can have one trial learning, but it can also be extinguished with like exposure. And I don't know to what extent disgust can be extinguished with exposure. But it seems to me that it's, at least I think it's easier to get rid of fear than it is to get rid of disgust. Is that something that you're seeing when it comes to people who are changing their moral views? And is so, if it's more tied to fear, does that make us more hopeful that, we can come together in unity over our morality if we can sort of extinguish some of the fears related to, moral values of someone who disagrees with us?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it touches on lots of other big questions. So I also think that, there's a conception of emotion called constructionism, which is a little less tied to kind of like here distinct and specific emotions with specific behavioral things.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can imagine each emotion as a kind of population of feeling, of states, and the disgust of, I don't know, eating mustard as a kid or beer. I mean, I think that's something that's very easily extinguished over the course of your lifespan, right? Or I think
right.
of people who eat the fermented shark meat in, in Iceland, I think, right? Or Sweden. Like
Mm-hmm.
many people think it's gross, but like culturally you can get used to taste. Like I like
Mm-hmm.
whiskey now, even though I thought it was disgusting before. So I think these emotions can blend in with each other. And I think I'm less focused on kind of fear per se, like a jump scare in a movie, and more upon this thought of like, is it dangerous to me? Is it something I should protect myself against? Right. So, a car's driving by, you're on the sidewalk, you're like, should I jump in front of it? The sense you get isn't like, oh my goodness, fear, but you're just like, that would be stupid, right? Like, I don't want to harm myself,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, I don't want to jump in front of a train. And so I think those feelings of like self-preservation and harm, I think are actually very hard to extinguish. And so the example I give in the book is, there's this thing called the Grand Canyon Skywalk, which is a plexiglass platform sticking out of the Grand Canyon. It's totally safe. You know that explicitly because they say you can like stack jumbo jets on it. If you stand on that though, it's still pretty terrifying, right? I mean, and again, not in the jump scare kind of way, but you're like, I just don't feel good about this, right? Or like you could stick a knife in an electrical outlet in your house and someone's like, no, it's cool. I killed the power. Just trust me. You're like, I'm not going to totally trust you on this one. It's just like because we evolved for so long to just like not make stupid choices about threat, about harm. And so I think that's super hard to extinguish, even if you get used to some kind of like disgusting or fearful things, right? This kind of like sense of harm.
Mm-hmm. Your book is centered around 3 myths. And I want to start with the first one because we on this podcast love to debunk, myths. So the first one is the myth of human nature that we evolved as apex predators. So this is where you sort of talk about what our evolutionary origins for morality might be. Can you sort of help us understand why that's a myth? Because I think a lot of people still ascribe to it.
Well, it makes sense that people think that we're predators because we are today. And we have been for, I don't know, 100,000 years at least. I mean, today we can shoot wolves from helicopters. We're totally safe from getting eaten. You can go to the grocery store and buy, choice cuts of animal. We're apex predators today. But human nature was forged not just in the last 1,000, 10,000, or even 100,000 years, but also stretching back, millions of years to our primate ancestors. Of course, we're primates, but you know what I'm saying. And so if you look at this record, there's this tendency to kind of project from today into the past. And you think that like, oh, like we were probably like ruthless cave people or like vicious, I don't know, angry apes. But if you look at the anthropological record, it was not this way. And so if you look at the kind of skulls of Australopithecus, if you look at other kind of hominid ancestors, they were mostly small, terrified creatures. I don't actually know if they're terrified. I can't give them surveys, but there's lots of evidence to suggest that they were mostly eaten and not eating other creatures. So there's one figure in the book. It's like my favorite figure in the whole book of like the skull of a hominid. And there's like puncture marks on the front of it. And there's just like this picture of a of a saber-toothed cat basically just like eating the entire head. And if you, in fact, I was just watching some YouTube videos, and there's pictures of big cats kind of like jumping at kids standing in front of zoo enclosures. And, they just like try to bite the head of these kids. And you're like, oh, that checks out. This is like how it's always been. Or like kids used to get picked off by giant harpy eagles, which today can pick up goats. But in the back, you'd be like out gathering berries as a parent. You'd like look, and then your like kid would be, I don't know, 100 feet up in the talons of an eagle. So I think there's all this evidence to suggest that we were constantly concerned about threats. We can't see in the dark, big cats can. Like, right, there's like all sorts of adaptation. Like, look at your claws. Like, these are not the claws of a predator. Or like, go into the forest at night and see if you feel, like bloodlust and you're excited to eat something. No, you're terrified, right? But if you're a tiger, you're like, it's cool. I'm just going to chill wherever I want because I'm a tiger and no one's going to eat me. But humans do not feel this way, right? If we're not in our groups, if we're not surrounded by walls, we're pretty terrified.
Yeah. And so how does that relate to what you think were the origins of morality?
Yeah. And so, there's like lots of kind of like dotted lines as you like, from like Australopithecus to like here we are today. But basically, if, we're a species that's more prey than predator, we need to find a way to kind of survive. And so in primate species and in actually a lot of prey species, that's about banding together into groups, right? So we live in herds, we live in tribes, humans, and we work together to protect ourselves. Working together also allows us to do more things like, gather more, actually do some hunting, right? Figure out technologies like stone-tipped spears, which did turn us into ruthless predators, it turns out. But now there's like a threat when you live in groups, and that's other people, right? Like now I'm surrounded by other people and like they want what I have, they get angry, I get angry, right? There's just like a tendency, if you ever observe children in daycares, right? They're ruthless and, filled with rage. And, you have to like teach those little monsters, those human beings to treat each other well and to cooperate, right? And not be violent. And it turns out what you're teaching them is morality. And so kind of over the course of human, development, evolution, we had to learn a kind of mental mechanism that kept us cooperating with each other, suppressed our violent instincts, especially within our own groups. Maybe we attack other groups sometimes, but within our groups, we try to work together, we try to cooperate, and we try not to like harm each other. And that's morality. And that sense of morality is really focused on kind of concerns about harm, protecting ourselves, protecting the vulnerable, because when societies have that kind of moral sense, they get along better, they cooperate better, they survive better, and the people within them do better. And so that's how you get from kind of prey to kind of social, groups to kind of a moral sense.
Yeah, I had to, that resonates this morning as I was taking my kids to school, and I had to have a good conversation with them and say, like, you need to stop attacking each other all the time, like putting each other down. Like, I didn't think I'd need to teach you, how to be kind of nice to each other, but I actually think that now that has to be an explicit thing that I teach, like, because it doesn't seem to come natural, at least not to my kids. So the next myth is the myth of the moral mind, that there are harmless wrongs. Tell us about that.
So I touched on it a little bit at the beginning of where this kind of idea came from, right? So there is an idea in the field and kind of more generally in society now popularized by Jonathan Haidt, this idea that like liberals and conservatives have fundamentally different moral minds, different moral foundations is kind of John's term. And the idea for foundations is that our mind is carved up into little boxes or mechanisms or modules, call it whatever you want. And these are kind of specific and specialized and kind of very separate in the way that like foundations suggest, right? They're like deep and they're kind of like entrenched in our minds and blocked off from other things. And it's argued that one of these foundations is about protecting ourselves from harm, but some of the other ones are about protecting ourselves from, or sorry, that's my view. Some of the other ones are not about harm, but instead about, being concerned about purity. And that's kind of connected to disgust, maybe you talk about, right? So not doing disgusting things, doing weird sex things, eating weird things. Maybe that's connected to kind of like religion in some ways. And then there's other concerns about like obeying authority or being loyal to your group. And so many in the field, like John, would say that these things are totally separate from harm. Except when I look at it, right, it seems like that's a myth, because every time I ask someone, how wrong are these actions, like talking back to your parents or not obeying a preacher or, burning an American flag or eating pizza off a corpse, right? People condemn those acts based on how much they see them as causing harm. And I think the kind of most interesting...
Sorry.
Yeah.
Can you unpack sort of what, let's get into the details of how you're testing that out. Like, how do you know that?
So the easiest thing to do, going back to what we first started talking about, is kind of survey methods, right?
Mm-hmm.
So just ask someone, right? Like, how wrong is it to eat pizza off a corpse? How wrong is it to, subvert an election? How wrong is it to, talk back to a preacher? And then you ask people, well, how much harm does this cause? Turns out the correlation between those things, amazingly high, like 0.8, right? It's like a super powerful predictor. But then, and I think here's where like the wrinkles are, right? I think John would say, well, those perceptions of harm are post hoc rationalization.
Mm-hmm.
So what's happening is you condemn. Can I give the example of like consensual incest? Because that's where the rubber really hits the road.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
I
So
mean,
here's
we're
the most
talking about
famous
corpses, and so
I know,
yeah,
right? I'm like leading up to it, like a little foot in the door thing. So the most famous example in moral psychology is Mark and Julie are siblings. One summer, they decide to go up to the mountains. They're staying in a cabin. They start kissing. They decide, wouldn't it be nice if they had sex together? Totally consensual. Mark wears a condom. Julie's on birth control. They both have a great time. They never do it again. They never talk about it. Is that okay? So this is an experiment. Kind of an experiment, kind of like the Stanford prison experiment. There's like no other real conditions. It's just like a kind of interesting thought experiment that you've kind of run with people. So if you ask people, is it wrong? They basically say, yes, that's wrong. And then you say, why? And they're like, well, they're going to have weird kids. And then you point to the example in the story, which is like, no, well, there's a condom and there's birth control. And they're like, well, it's going to destroy the relationship. And it's like, well, no, I told you it's not going to destroy their relationship. It's going to destroy their family. No, they don't tell anybody. Anyways, right? And so at the end of this kind of like interview with the experimenter, the interview's like convinced you. You're like, look, I told you it's harmless. And yet you still kind of condemn it in some sense. And so you must be condemning this act based on something other than harm, because I've designed it to be harmless. And so, behold, doesn't this demonstrate that our mind cares about things beyond harm? Because this is disgusting, makes you feel bad, but it's not harmful. So out of this one example and a bunch of other kind of anthropological work around it, grew out of this idea that people condemn acts based on more than harm. Right? Because people will condemn Mark and Julie and it's harmless. But my kind of rebuttal is that this example, Mark and Julie and other things like it, people don't believe in an intuitive gut level that it's harmless. And if morality is a gut feeling, and everyone agrees that it is, then if harm's a gut feeling, then you just get this like bright arrow from one to the other, right?
Yeah.
People don't intuitively believe that having sex with your sister or brother is totally harmless, right? And so if you just grant that like maybe people aren't convinced that it's harmless, they can still condemn it based on harm, but it's now your intuitive feeling instead of your explicit reasoning.
And I think that's one of the reasons why I feel like it's so tied to disgust and insolence, because that is literally to me, the definition of gut feeling is, how it relates to that. And it's still hard for me to I guess I see your point that in some ways though, you're setting it up that it's never going to be disprovable. Does that worry you in terms of science?
No, it's completely disprovable. And I think it's more disprovable than the moral foundations hypothesis. Like, I'm not saying, I think many times John is like, well, like, let's say like, why do people care so much about COVID? And John would, the answer should be disgust and purity, because like that's a kind of, like something in your body. And then John's like, no, that's not purity. That's like loyalty, because it's about like what narrative or like authority. Like, do you believe in Fauci, right? So I think moral foundations theory gives you lots of like slippery moves to dodge around. I have one hypothesis, and that is that people's intuitive perceptions of harm drive their moral cognition. And so all you have to do is show me an example where people don't have intuitive judgments of harm and then they condemn it, or people do condemn it and they don't have these intuitive judgments of harm.
I see. So, and you just feel like the Mark and Julie doesn't satisfy that because there is this gut feeling of harm.
Exactly. And follow-up studies have found this, right? I mean, the Mark and Julie example that John did was never published, right? But if you follow up with other things and you ask people like, is it really harmless? Like, would you bet money that it's harmless? Or what we've done is we've like looked at their physiology, right?
Right.
And we basically show that like your physiological reaction to this thing that you like feel, that it's really harmful, that predicts your moral judgment. Like, it's not me as an experimenter being like, no, it's harmful. Like, trust me. It's like people themselves being like, yeah. Like, I just think I can't believe that this is like something that's going to be harmless,
Mm-hmm. One of the other things that you talk about in your book is the role that vulnerability, blame, and suffering play in terms of how, I mean, those are 3 big chapters. So like just put them into one. But I wanted to hear you talk about how those elements seem to be drivers of economic success for a lot of social media companies, is preying on those human elements, and maybe help to explain the rise of the divisions. What do you think about sort of the current state of society in 2025, how that's been influenced by social media, and how that relates to how our moral minds essentially are changing?
Yeah, so that's a big question. I feel like there's lots of ways to go. Maybe I'll focus on the kind of social media part.
Great.
And then we can talk more about kind of vulnerability or questions of blame. And I'm also happy to talk a little bit about moral judgment if you want, kind of like more technically how we tested hypotheses. But I think social media is interesting and we've got data on it. So we have this paper about moral panics. And we argue that social media is really causing these moral panics today for a couple of reasons. One, social media companies have a limitless supply of threats in your feeds. Like, they populate it with, this terrible thing's happening, this terrible thing's happening. And we as a species concerned about threats fixate on those things, right? We're also a social species, as we talked about. We live in groups and we care what other people think. And we use their kind of feedback as a way of trying to figure out what a real threat is. So if you're like, sitting on the street corner, you're like sipping a cappuccino and you see this like flood of people screaming, Godzilla, and they're running at you, then I think you're like, oh shit, I think there's a big dinosaur and I should get up and run as well, right? This is how we're attuned. Or like in real life, right? If everyone's worried, snake, right? Like monkeys climb the tree. And so social media is basically like everyone screaming Godzilla or like other monkeys screaming snake, because you've got virality measures in each post that says like there's 4,000 people who are worried about this, right? They're retweeting it and they're commenting about it, right? And so what social media does is basically incites moral panics because it has lots of threats and lots of kind of social proof. And so when we run studies on social media, we find that you can really increase kind of feelings of outrage and your intention to kind of, share these feelings of outrage based on kind of how much these threats seem harmful and how much these threats seem like everyone's sharing them. And it's not just like feelings of anger per se, but those like worries about threats and protecting the vulnerable. And so the one study I really love, I have a postdoc who invented this kind of idea. He was like, what's a new, because you can't look at, current moral panics because it's tied up with politics. He invented something called dizzy dogging, #dizzy dogging. And it's a Twitter post where someone's like, oh man, like I got my dog so dizzy with a laser pointer. And then he like ran into things and stumbled down the stairs. Ha ha ha. And then we either, varied that this was shared, 4 times or thousands of times. And so when people thought that dogs were being hurt and it was being shared by many people, there was so much more outrage, right? There's like, wow, there's this threat out there and I need to combat it by being angry and yelling at the people who are doing this, right? So I think that kind of shows that these like feelings of vulnerability kind of like towards, the innocent targets like dogs and the threats associated with them tied with virality. Now you're really upset.
Unless you're a cat person.
Unless you're a cat, right? We didn't do dizzy catting. Right? Everyone be like, whatever, cats, they can take it.
Okay, so let's get the second part then, and the sort of moral judgment. Tell us about that.
Right. So, often I get this question of like, well, if we all have the same moral mind and it's all based on conceptions of harm, then like, why do we disagree about anything? Right? Like, aren't you just like stripping away all the variability and all the disagreement from the world? And the answer is no, I am not. People clearly disagree, but they don't disagree on these different values, right? Like liberals, contrary to what John Haidt says, like liberals also care about loyalty if it's about like labor solidarity and unions, right? Liberals also care about purity if it's about hot yoga juice cleanses, like those are not being done by like evangelical conservatives, right? And so we all care about all these different values. There's not like some liberals or some conservative values, kind of depends how you pick the examples. We all care about protecting the vulnerable and ourselves from harm. But the thing is that we, because of how we're raised, because of our like, media environments, see different people as especially vulnerable to victimization. Going back to what you mentioned, a while ago about like, the truth of who's being victimized.
Yeah.
And so every hot button debate that's out there really revolves around, you think that this group is especially vulnerable to harm, and the other group thinks that they're not. Like, so with abortion, like fetuses versus kind of pregnant women, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's not that one group's like, I don't care about harm at all. You're just like, no, the real harm is like fetuses, and you're a baby killer if you're pro-abortion or pro-choice. Whereas pro-choice folks are like, well, you don't care about women at all. And you're just like, trying to hurt them. And of course, people on each side aren't trying to hurt the other ones, but you still feel like they're kind of ignoring the legitimacy of these vulnerable victims.
Right. So where do we go from here? The myth that you start part 3 of your book with is that facts bridge divides. And on this podcast, we know that, facts are something that, have lost a lot of their power over the course of the last decade or so. So how do we bridge these divides?
It's tough. We are divided today. And obviously I want to say as a scientist and just like a general person in society, like facts matter. They definitely matter.
Yeah.
And actually, if you ask people, hey, imagine you're having a conversation about politics with someone you disagree with, what should they talk about to make you respect them? Most people do think facts, right? Like, I just want you to have the facts. And so in our experiments, we say, great, here are the facts. And then people say, not those facts. Those are not the right facts. I want the facts that support my viewpoint.
Yeah.
So now we've got like partisan facts. We've got fake facts. And so it turns out that facts are kind of like the wrong thing when it comes to morality, right? Because if you're like, well, this is what I believe about morality. And I'm like, well, here's a fact you didn't know. No one's ever like, oh my God, you're right. That's a really good fact. Like, you heard this on NPR? Oh my goodness. Like, I guess I'll give up my viewpoint on abortion or immigration, right? Like, never has that happened. And so people think, facts are important because like, I'm trying to win an argument with someone, but like, you can't win an argument when it comes to morality. Instead, the best thing you can do is understand where people are coming from, understand the harms or threats that people see. And to do that, I think we need to rely, my data suggests, on kind of these stories, personal experiences of harm. And so in one study, we had people talk about guns and the gun debate. And the debate either kicked off with a kind of an accomplice, who's in cahoots with us, accusing the other side of being un-American for having their particular view on guns, really gets like people excited and, angry. And then says, well, the reason I am, let's say, pro-gun, says the accomplice, pro-gun rights, is because either, somewhere between 70,000 and 1.2 million people every year defend themselves with a firearm, a statistic, a fact, or says, one day my mom used a gun to defend herself from a home intruder.
Right.
It's just one anecdote. But now people think that anecdote is much truer, think that the person who's giving it is much more rational for having their views pro-guns, and they respect them much more, right? Because you can kind of dispute the kind of facts, but like when someone's concerned about threats to themselves or their family, that seems more real in a powerful sense.
Yeah, and I think it doesn't mean that you can't then also follow up with, here are the facts related to how many people are, killed by guns in their own homes, et cetera. But like, here's, I'm on the other side of that moral question. So I would say, well, here's a story about, my friend's nephew who shot his sister, that kind of thing. Like that would be the one. And then follow it up with like, and did you know that this happens all the time and blah, blah, blah. But I take your point, and I think that there is this, we can't just have the stories and think that, that's going to be because of course everybody has a story, and that's where science can come in and say which stories actually represent the general majority versus which stories are outliers. So I don't, I don't know that the way forward is just to rely on simple anecdotes or simple outliers, but rather to think about ways of personalizing or creating personal relevance out of the facts that scientists are collecting.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I mean, I think some stories are more representative of statistical truths. At the same time, again, when it comes to morality, even if you could show someone some kind of general statistical truth, right? Folks would argue that like those statistical truths are not relevant.
Right.
They're not the things that most bear on the issues. Like with guns, like sure, lots of people, get harmed with guns every year, but like they're not trained in gun safety. They're not using the right precautions. And even if that's true in the past, when the apocalypse comes and everyone turns into zombies or like people overthrow the government, like I still need my gun. There's still this harm that I see. And so I 100% agree that like stories by themselves are not, shouldn't drive this kind of viewpoint. But like morality, again, because it's about gut feelings of harm, you could have all the stats in the world and it's not going to do anything. And so I think the best we can do is have a conversation where someone feels understood, someone feels heard, and then you can talk about the kind of like narrow range of cases that we all kind of feel conflicted about and try to nudge each other one way or the other. But like, it's hard to even go in with the conversation thinking like, well, I'm going to tell a story and then I'm going to hit them with the facts. It's like still not the right motivation, right? I'm going to understand them.
Yeah.
Full stop.
And, and what what your data are showing is that, that a lot of these morals, the things that make us angry when we feel like we're being morally, not judged, but wronged, is because of the threat of harm. And of course, the way to help even anyone, I see this all the time with my kids, like, how do I help them get over their fears is by first listening to them voice those fears, validating them, and then giving them an alternative. But not listening or just telling them they're outright wrong and that there is nothing to fear is not effective. That does not
totally. I mean, especially in moral altercations, right? And so not just fear, like, oh, the dark's fine, but like, I have two kids, like one kid hurts the other kid like retaliates. They're both crying. They both feel victimized. They both point to objective senses of victimization, right? Like this person did say something nasty and then you punched them and then this person was punched, right? So you were both wronged. And you can't be like, no, think about it. You're not the real victim because like they're in pain, they're crying, and like no one agrees with the statement of like, just forget about your inner turmoil and pain and sense of injustice, right? So you're right. You have to validate someone. But as a parent, you have to be like, well, you both feel like you're both a-holes. That's usually what I come down in, right? Like everyone's wrong here. But everyone is like also a little bit right. And so it's a hard thing to do.
Yeah. So I want to remind our listener that Kurt's book, Outraged, Why We Fight About Morality in Politics and How to Find Common Ground, is available now at booksellers everywhere. Kurt, you end your book with a chapter titled Hope. So what is it that makes you hopeful that maybe some of these divides can be bridged?
I mean, not to go into personal experiences too much, but
well, no, they work, so go for it.
Totally, they work. I mean, I've just had so many examples of, I have a statistical truth in a sense, which is I teach a class on this, and kind of young folks and students are so hungry to have these kind of authentic conversations, bridging moral divides, to kind of understand folks on the other side and to kind of like reconnect with family members, with friends about, about these issues and beyond these issues. And I have stories too, right? Like one example, like I took an Uber ride to the airport. I tell them what I study, politics and morality. And everyone's like, oh my, hold my beer. Like, here's what I think about morality and politics, right? This guy says, look, I'm a Christian nationalist, but not the typical kind. Okay, well, I'm interested, right? Like what, how are you atypically Christian nationalist? So he tells me all the things he believes in. 20 minutes, I'm asking questions, genuine questions. I'm trying to understand. And then we're driving up the kind of ramp to the airport and we start talking about abortion. And he starts likening the kind of pro-choice folks to Nazis. Right? Maybe not that surprising. But what is surprising is I said, look, we're trying to have a kind of like good faith conversation here about morality. And you can't compare half of the country to the Nazis. It's just not acceptable. And it's not who they are. And he says, you know what? You're right. I'm sorry. I need to take a step back. He's basically making a slippery slope argument. Like you ignore the sanctity of life with fetuses. What's next? That's not how it came out. But I called him on it. And he says, I'm sorry. I'm going to take a step back. And like, now this is what I meant. And so the only way that we could have that conversation, he felt secure enough to like apologize in a sense, is because I listened for understanding. And there are so many organizations out there that are trying to get people to do this, not just scientists, right? But like trying to encourage like, listen first. Like that's a coalition of 500 organizations that are like trying to get people to kind of listen. And so I think there's like this groundswell support for listening. And that makes me optimistic.
Well, I hope it does lead to some powerful changes and some bridging of those divisions. Kurt Gray, thank you so much for being on Inquiring Minds.
Thanks for having me.
So that's it for another episode. Thanks for listening. If you want to hear more, don't forget to subscribe. If you'd like to get an ad-free version of the show, consider supporting us at patreon.com/inquiringminds. I want to especially thank our longtime supporters, David Noel, Herring Chen, Yushi Lin, Jay Henry, Joelle, Dale Lemaster, Charles Blyle, and Matthew Rowland. Inquiring Minds is produced by Why Not Alchemy. I'm your host, Indre Viskontas. See you next time.